Let's do rebel music history.
Let's do it. Okay, so to reorient people about what this series is that while folks are stuck in quarantine, want to give folks an opportunity to dig into some music that they might not otherwise know, that can invite some aliveness, and then also so that we can explore the role of culture and music in social movement histories, moments of upheaval and great change, like we're in now. And so we've already talked about South Africa, we've talked about Jamaica and the UK, we've talked about the Dust Bowl after the Great Depression in the United States, and now let's talk about Nigeria. Post-colonial Nigeria, starting around the 1970s through the 90s is the period that I want to talk about, which you know the context better than I do, Michael. But so maybe I'll introduce the album and give it some context, and you can layer on whatever you want with that. But the record I want to talk about is Fela Kuti's Beasts of No Nation. And before I get into this specific album, I just want to say that I was talking earlier about how I've been stuck in the quicksand, and I had just been sort of in this sort of like slow motion malaise. And I turned to Afrobeat to get me out of it, because this music is like, it wakes up every cell in my body. It's like, I grew up in 4-chord punk rock. And when I first started hearing Fela Kuti, I was just blown at like how textured and layered and multidimensional and polyrhythmic music could be, period. He like channels chanting and protest and jazz and funk and Yoruba drums, and it's ancestral and it's visionary. It's like Afrofuturism. It's this incredible innovative mix that spawned its whole own genre of music. And so the context for it is, this is shortly after and during the Nigerian Civil War, post-oil boom. The regime is awash in all of this petrol money and corruption. And Fela Kuti comes out of a prominent kind of petty bourgeois family that is, his father's a preacher and an educator, and his mother's actually a communist militant who met Mao and knew Kwame Nkrumah and had like carried a particular legacy of sort of African Marxist-Leninism. And so he's sort of that kind of interesting milieu. And because of that, he goes and gets educated abroad. And so he goes to London. He ends up later in Los Angeles, where he meets Black Panthers. He gets sort of explicitly politicized by reading Malcolm X's autobiography, comes first into a, Pan-African kind of Black nationalist identity, goes back to Nigeria in the middle of the Biafra War. And he's living in Lagos, living in a working class community that where, the conditions in Lagos at the time, it's, I don't know if it's the biggest city in Africa or one of the biggest. It's a sort of massive, sort of hyper contracted, a lot of people penned into a small place where there's basically a military occupation, and people are, executed on the beaches publicly every month for stealing, and there's soldiers everywhere. And in that context, where there seems to be just no outlet for resistance, no outlet for organizing, he starts to organize through institution building, through music. Two institutions that I want to talk about. One is a place called the Africa Shrine, where he would perform every night. And he would perform for like 10 hours until dawn every single night. Different nights had different themes. So some nights were for like political ranting and rallying. Some nights were for Yoruba rituals, and both of which were incorporated into, the concert, the music. When he was doing Yoruba ceremony, his altar at the Africa Shrine had Malcolm X on it, Kwame Nkrumah on it, and his mom on it. And it's there that he innovates these songs in the context of immediately responding to the political context and political moments. And the people who go there are, the large base is poor urban Nigerians from Lagos, but there's also people like this huge mixing of like different kind of social classes that are kind of there undercover, that just want some outlet under this sort of repressive moment. It's one of the only places of visible political discourse. He's releasing music that is, the most popular music in the country, even though it's banned from the radio. You like walk down the streets and it's blasting on speakers everywhere. Meanwhile, he, over time, as he gets more famous and as he gets money from this, he doesn't use that resource to like leave the country, even though throughout the 70s, he's fully become like probably the first, at least the most famous, post-colonial, countercultural African superstar. And so he's got this like sex appeal. He's like full of his contradictions. He's like really messy. He like curses and smokes and is like, he's not a clean like figure at all.
Not at all.
Yeah, he's a rebel figure, and he's deeply spiritual. And he's kind of, in many ways, there's parallels to Bob Marley, but he's not like pious like Bob Marley. Like Bob Marley is like, it has a level of rigor that Fela brings to his music and his politics, but not necessarily to his personal practice. And so he has a compound that becomes basically a commune where hundreds of people are living, that he's employing basically like gangsters who are living there. And it becomes basically like an autonomous zone that is, like in some ways sort of perceived as kind of seceding. And it's like just down the street from a military barracks. And so all of this is seen as such a direct threat that it gets raided in 1977 by 1,000 soldiers, where they cut off the power. And because he has like arms, he has his own kind of army, and they like cut off the power to his barbed wire fence. They brutalize everybody. They throw his mom out of a second-story window. They rape the women. I mean, it's literal war.
His mother dies because of injuries. I mean, it's horrible. Yeah.
She dies because of those injuries. And his album, that's called, what's it called? Coffin for Head of State, is about that, and about like delivering his mother's coffin to the president. And so and that was right after a record called Zombie, describing all of the goose stepping of the soldiers. So anyway, I'll get to the end of this, which is that it gets raided again. He then, in 1984, gets arrested on some bullshit. And the judge later confesses that the military pressured him into being arrested. And I mean, into like whatever, escalating the sentence. The judge gets fired, he gets released, and then he puts out this record. So the record, Beasts of No Nation, is his first record out of his imprisonment. And this is after, this is with the Egypt 80. So it's sort of his
Hold
second
it in front
band.
of your face. Hold it in front of your face just so they can see the whole thing. No, pull it back a little. Okay, so cool. Got it. Perfect.
This is the album. And you can see the targets of the record are, Buhari, which is the Nigerian regime, Botha from, the South African apartheid regime, Reagan, Thatcher. And he also has in his music a level of precision. I don't know their names, but he calls out like military leaders and even like local soldiers by name. And at this point, his band, the Egypt 80, which is like includes his son and is sort of the second wave, is like tight. And they have a level, his whole catalog is really worth listening to. And the evolution of his music is tremendous. But this record at this point, this is just one song, and the song is so long it takes up both sides of the album. You have to like listen to one side and then pause it and flip it over to listen to the rest of the song. And so it just struck me. The reason why I picked it for this week was just because I thought other people might be, stuck in their malaise too, and might want to be lifted up by this complex, interesting, music that can awaken like every cell in your body. But also, he really was committed to being of the people. Despite his class background, he had long-term commitments that got increasingly oriented towards revolution over time in a complicated way that in some ways mimics dual power, which is something I think people need to be studying in the wake of our loss from the Bernie campaign. And I don't mean dual power in the Leninist sense of like you build the workers' council and they contend for power with the state. I mean, more in kind of the syndicalist sense, which is like you build up this alternative infrastructure while you're simultaneously contesting for power within the mainstream institutions. Like he ran for president. It was unsuccessful, but it was also an interesting part of his story. And then you build a relationship between the two so that you can cede power from one to the other, which is actually what Bernie did in Vermont when he like faced all these roadblocks and built all these councils and like delegated power to them so that he could get around his roadblocks. And so, you know, it's his story is complex and messy, but the level of threat that his music posed was just tremendous and evidenced by the level of oppression. So listen to
I used to I remember when I discovered Fela back probably in college. Specifically, I mean, Zombie is amazing and really gives you it's probably his most well-known, I think. So like if you're just going to kind of hear it, it's almost like the Legend album equivalent or something, but it is really funny because if you listen to the lyrics and you don't need to know that much, that basically, and I think this was like his first kind of, he was huge in Nigeria, but that was like an international hit. It's getting played at clubs across Africa into Europe. And it's not, it isn't like a righteous call against the military. It's a mockery.
Yeah.
I mean, the dance that goes along with it's so disrespectful. It's like, you look stupid. You sound ridiculous. He even impersonates at one point like the gruff voice of like a commander telling like troops to get into formation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also and I also recall in the chapter in a book, I'll do a video soon where I give book recommendations, but there's a really interesting book called, I'm literally forgetting. I think it's called The Dream Deferred, Thabo Mbeki and the Future of the South African Dream. And Thabo Mbeki I've mentioned him. He's a fascinating political figure. He was the guy who came after Nelson Mandela. And at any rate, one of his diplomatic postings when he was an African National Congress operative fighting apartheid was in Lagos. And he clearly was like amazed by Fela Kuti and also a little shocked.
Yeah.
Like this combination of like someone who had basically been raised, his family were communists, but kind of with like the mindset of being petite bourgeois, almost like Christian missionaries in a certain way, then getting drafted into the movement, going to Sussex, training in guerrilla warfare in the Soviet Union, like a combination of like, and a lot of people in this generation of like, African revolutionary, British gentleman, Soviet operative, like all of these tendencies, all of which are incredibly disciplined. And then on one hand being like, oh my God, like this guy is post-colonial, like, whoa. And then at the same time, like, whoa, that's very messy. And that's just like a fascinating, interaction in that book. And Fela is like all of these great pieces of music. You could learn a ton of history. I don't want to bum people out. An ironic kind of note here is that the current president of Nigeria is Buhari. So, he didn't win. This time he won elections. He didn't come in a military coup, but history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
I have a 30-second interview that I put in the thing if you want to play it.
Oh yeah, let's play that real quick, and then we'll see if there's any more questions. We'll take another question and we'll wrap up.
It's coming. Just give me 1 second.
Sweet.
Okay.
Fela sees his role as being very different from that of the white musician.
Yes, if you are in England, music can be an instrument of enjoyment. So you can sing about love, you can sing about whom you're going to bed with next. But in my environment, my society is underdeveloping because of an alien system on our people now. So there's no music for enjoyment. There's nothing like love. There's something like a struggle for people's existence. So, as an artist, politically, artistically. The whole idea about your environment must be represented in the music, in the arts. So really, art is what is happening at a particular time of a people's development or underdevelopment, see. So I think as far as Africa is concerned, music cannot be for enjoyment. Music has to be for revolution. Really.
Although his music is really fun.
Yeah, it's super enjoyable.
It's
But
super
I
enjoyable.
love how he, in a way, articulated a materialist spirituality, where he was like, this spiritual music that comes from our ancestors is born out of our immediate material conditions, and that's how you need to understand my music.
Absolutely. And I have to say, someone in the Discord said, keep going. I had no idea he was a communist. I thought he was just a rebellious playboy. Well, he was also a rebellious playboy.
Yeah.
That's what's awesome about human beings. He was all of these things. He was deeply spiritual, radical, and definitely a rebellious playboy. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.